Hello and welcome. My name is Manuel Quintana with Pragmatic Works, and here in this video, we're going to be looking at Power BI and specifically diving into the world of DirectQuery. We're going to discuss what DirectQuery is all about, how does it present itself, where do we even get the option to use DirectQuery? Maybe you've never even seen this in Power BI. And it all breaks down to one thing. What data source are we connecting to? So when we are connecting to the 80 plus different connectors that are available inside of Power BI, sometimes you'll never even see a choice. You just connect. Let's say you're doing text CSV or Excel or web, and it just connects. You point to the location, and either you go to the Power Query editor or you go in the data model and you start visualizing. But sometimes you're going to get a choice. And there's really going to be 3 total options here. Now, the first one we're really not going to be discussing too much. In this first part video, this part 1 of probably a 3-part series, we're really going to be focusing on the second item I'm going to discuss here. But this one here might be in that 3rd video. The reason why I say might is because live connection, really in the grand scheme of what we're going to talk about, I think it's kind of fallen behind. Right now, live connection is supported by a couple of sources, but primarily we're talking about on-premises analysis services multidimensional and tabular instances. That's pretty much it. The biggest thing here is that live connection does not support currently what is known as a composite model. That's going to be a conversation on video number 2. What's composite model all about? Why is there so much hype about it? What's the benefit of it? Because it's awesome, but we're going to save that for the next video. Our focus in this one is right here. DirectQuery. And we are going to focus on it and look and observe this within the lens of SQL Server. So that's what I'm going to be connecting to. But the main thing to understand is within Power BI, lots of different connections do support the option of choosing between import or DirectQuery. A lot of these are going to pretty much be relational database management systems. So SQL Server, Oracle, DB2. When you connect, there literally is a button, and I'm going to show you that as we go through the demonstration. Do you want to import or do you want to do DirectQuery? And we're going to break down those storage modes here in a little bit. But if you always want to get an up-to-date listing of what connections support DirectQuery, the best way is obviously to just go right to the Microsoft documentation. If you just search Power BI DirectQuery connections, you literally will get a grid. It actually brings up every connection, and one of them is, does it support DirectQuery with a check mark or not? Does it support live connection? Check mark or not? So definitely go there for the most up-to-date information and details. But pretty much, if it's a relational database, it's going to have this. It's going to be available to us. And when we go in later on, we're going to be in this DirectQuery. We're going to talk about a topic called query folding. It's basically what makes this work. And I think it'll make a little more sense why I'm saying relational databases equals the option to go in DirectQuery. Now, the common thing, probably the most common way that users are connecting right now to data inside of Power BI is using import. And now, honestly, when we are bragging about and talking about all the awesome features in Power BI, we're talking about all the things you can do with DAX and all the stuff you can do in the Power Query editor. When we speak about the 100% functionality of those tools and what we can get from it, we're talking about working with data inside of the Power BI model using imported data. Now, if you've connected to a source and you never see a choice between live, direct, or import, you're importing. That's kind of like the default method if there's no other option. And we're going to talk once again about query folding, but it'll make much more sense. The idea is DirectQuery allows Power BI to translate what it's doing to the native language of whatever we're connecting to. So if we're connecting to Excel or text CSV, what's the native language? There isn't any way we can do this. So we just import it. We bring it into the local Power BI model. So this is really the standard kind of normal way that you work with it. If you've never heard of DirectQuery or Live, you've never chosen it, you've been working with import all along. A lot of the other videos you'll find here on this YouTube channel is working with imported data sets. So that's a pretty standard way, and I might be doing a video specifically on that, but pretty much everything that we showcase inside of our YouTube videos is because we're importing the data. We're literally bringing it. You can consider like copying it over into the local Power BI model. But enough of import. We're here to talk about DirectQuery. I guess we can't say forget about import, because the whole idea is why. What's the difference? Why will we go one direction versus another? So once again, the pros. When we decide to connect, and let's just stay with a specific conversation. Let's start with SQL Server. That gives us the choice whether we're talking about Azure SQL Server or on-prem, right? You're going to get the choice, DirectQuery or import. If we were to go with an import, we are literally going to be choosing what tables we want to connect to or potentially views, and we are going to bring whatever information we specify over into the Power BI model. The data will actually be brought over and stored in the local Power BI model. So this is what takes up space in our Power BI model. This is what's going to make that PBIX file grow in size. But the benefit of this is that all the data is right there. It's local. It's readily available to users when they're filtering the data, when they're moving through that, when they're exploring it. When I'm observing data for, the breakdown of my total sales by the last 10 years, and I want to add another filter in to view that by the United States, one specific country of the, 6 that I have available to me, when I click that filter, it's going to be snappy. It's going to be responsive because it doesn't have to go anywhere to get those results. It's right there in the Power BI model. I don't need to go back to the SQL Server. I don't need to go back to Oracle. It's local. That's what we mean when we import. That's what we mean by the Power BI model. Unrivaled query performance because it's doing everything kind of in-house. And this really gives the users a fantastic end user experience. But the problem is there's going to be a limitation on how much data. So when we start moving into the realm of big data and working with a massive amounts of data, I know that term is relative. It really is going to be that case. I'm going to have some other videos later on which talks about capacities, because capacities have to be a consideration when you talk about using import or direct. Because if you're importing, that means you're increasing the size of your data model, which will also have an impact on how you can publish it, how we're going to refresh it. There's actually limitations on what maximum size of Power BI file that you can actually publish to the service, depending on if you have dedicated or not. So data size limitations is a real thing when it comes to importing. So yeah, it's going to be that super awesome, slick, fast response time for end users, but we're loading it in. Power BI is an in-memory technology, right? It's going to be putting stuff into cache, so sometimes we can hit some limitations in there. And at the same time, because we're bringing stuff into the local Power BI model, that data is static, which means we have to schedule refreshes. Now, there's other fun things in the mix. You can do incremental refresh to make this more efficient and effective. But at the end of the day, if we're bringing any data over and it's inside the Power BI report, we have to schedule a refresh. So we're introducing kind of a degree of latency there. So really it boils down to report requirements. Do we need near real-time refreshing of data? If that's the case, DirectQuery starts to look a little bit better. Because now with DirectQuery, we don't store any data in the local model. You'll actually see, if you go back a second, if we go back to this previous screenshot, how Power BI presents itself with DirectQuery. We don't even have a data view button. This button that's normally located right here between the report view and the model view, gone. You can see it's there in the import because we have data. But when we talk about DirectQuery, we don't store anything. We pretty much are just saying, okay, here's the source that I'm connecting to. What request of data do we want to send to it? And those requests come in the form of our visualizations. We bring in a slicer that we want to show a list of our years. That is the request. We're going to go over to the date table in the source system. We're going to bring back a list of our dates. We want to have a bar chart that breaks down our total sales by country. That query is sent to our SQL Server. We wait for it to process it, and then the response comes back, and then we get it visualized. So you might be hearing my description of this and wondering, could that be slow? Potentially. Where we described import as having this awesome, responsive, snappy kind of interaction for our end users, just super fast response for these requests, DirectQuery kind of goes in the other direction. And we really fall into this realm where troubleshooting now, for performance tuning purposes, falls into two boundaries. We're talking about performance tuning, yes, Power BI and the data there, but now since we're basically pushing this workload over to the source system, considerations have to be made there in that source system. What kind of resources are available there? Are we going to be adding extra workload there that it can't really handle? What is happening at the same time that these reports are being consumed? A lot more questions come into play that actually live outside of Power BI when we start going this DirectQuery route. But it lets us work with large, massive tables that we otherwise might not ever be able to. And it lets us circumnavigate or move beyond that limitation I described. If my company doesn't have Power BI Premium or dedicated, and I know there's a 1 gigabyte limit on this Power BI file, and the only way for me to get it up there to be allowed to publish it is going to be through DirectQuery. So it allows us to kind of move around that. So DirectQuery, basically having a connection to that source system and pushing requests through, and then we wait for those responses. There is some caching that happens inside of Power BI to make things a bit more efficient. Or import, we just make that connection, bring everything over in one lump sum, store it locally, but then we have to have refreshes. DirectQuery doesn't need them. So really, there are certain situations where you'll kind of be driven towards DirectQuery where you're going to have to go that route. But when I have the chance, I really like to import my data into my reports because I love that snappy response that my users are going to have when working with that information. But there are going to be situations when we're working with massive amounts of data that DirectQuery is going to be our only route. But the best part is there are some additional options. We're not going to be covering it in this video. That's going to come in the form of composite models. So before I bring that up, that'll be how I wrap up today to talk about what I'm going to do next. Let's go ahead and let's take a look. What does it look like when I'm presented the option of DirectQuery? How can I tell that I am in DirectQuery? What are the impacts that are going on here? So why don't you go ahead and let's join me over into Power BI. In this little demonstration, I'm going to be connecting to my Azure SQL database, but if you want to kind of follow along in your own light, you can as well. Let's head over to Power BI. So here I am, Power BI, absolutely connected to nothing as of right now, and I'm actually going to connect to an Azure SQL database here, all right? So I already have it in my recent sources, but the same thing can be, right? If I hit get data, right, or right here, SQL Server, I go to SQL Server, and I put in my server credentials. In this case, literally, I'll just start with, it doesn't really matter, but I'll just put in localhost temporarily, just for now, because you can see what is important to us right here. Data connectivity mode. Do you want to import this, or do you want to go with DirectQuery? So if I went with the DirectQuery right here, what I'll do is I'll actually connect to my Azure connection, which is already set to a DirectQuery. It's going to be our data warehouse, and I can say, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and bring in just a couple small tables just to bring customer, product, and fact internet sales. Just a couple of different things, and we're going to go ahead and I'm going to hit load. As soon as we do this, you can see, what do we want to use? I'm going to use DirectQuery. And when you're going along this route, I recommend kind of starting with DirectQuery if you think you might need it, and then you can switch it to import should you so choose. But look how fast that was. And also take a look at what's not here. I don't have a data view. There's no way for me to actually explore this kind of in that tabular view, that tabular sense that we normally would have if we were importing. There's no data in here. And if we ended up saving this report and looking at the size of this PBIX file, it is going to be minuscule because all that's stored in here is pretty much metadata, the name of columns, the name of tables, and that's about it. But what we can do is go ahead. Let me show this real quick. It's a kind of nice, easy way to see, hey, this is what's going on. If I go to view and I turn on our performance analyzer, I'm going to turn this on for a second, right? Just so we can see something. Go back to home. We'll just leave this here. I'm going to go ahead. It's started. I'm going to bring in a visual, just something standard. Let's go ahead and check out our breakdown. I'm just going to go with this. I want to show my sales amounts. Actually, what I'll do is I'll do it by customer. I'm just going to break this down by gender. And you can see it's already thinking, right? Look how long that took there. 2,000 milliseconds, all right? I want to break down my sales amount by gender. Yeah, it's pretty close. And notice, look how this drastically changed. This is showcasing this visualization. I changed the filter. I added the filter for gender. And if we expand this showcases like breaking down of that 2,000 milliseconds, what took time. Now this one had an odd delay that was located under other, but the key thing is DirectQuery. You can see this is letting me know I'm effectively sending a request over to the, in this case, Azure SQL database, and then it's coming back. And then when I added in sales amount, we sent another request. Here's DirectQuery again. So this is what is occurring. We basically have a line that's open to our source system, and as we add visuals and as we interact with filters, those requests are being made. But I am seeing the data live from that source system. Now, if we wanted, we can very easily also view this in the modeling view. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of the performance analyzer, kind of clean this up. If I go over to the modeling view, we can see we have some little indication here at the top. And with the new model view, it's kind of neat. It kind of breaks it down. Here's the name of the table. What's the storage mode? It's DirectQuery. What are we pointing to? So it's all right here. We can see it, which is pretty darn cool. I like the new display. And if I wanted to, maybe dim product, dim customer, I don't want to do direct query anymore. You can actually change it right here. So that is one way we can achieve this. But another thing that we should be aware of, right? Right now we know I've got a connection. It's pointing to my SQL Server. I've got access to these 3 tables. Every time I add visuals, it's making a request of that data. Well, something that we should know is that there are limitations when it comes to DAX as well as the Power Query Editor. So the transformed data, the Power Query Editor, there are limitations that exist here that we do not have access to. When we look at the documentation, it says if we are able to achieve non-complex transformations. If we wanted to go ahead and reduce the number of columns of here, that's not a problem. I can say, you know what? In this customer table, I don't want to have these different language educations, right? Just, I don't know, I'm just picking a couple. When I hit OK, it just does it. It works, right? And even more so, if you go over here to the right-hand side, you can right-click this, and there is an option here that says View Native Query. This is what I spoke about. It's called query folding. So as long as what we're achieving in the Power Query Editor can be translated into a SQL statement, that's because we're working with SQL here, it's going to be good. But if I were immediately, the moment that I try to do something here, which isn't allowed or isn't able to be translated, so it would qualify as being complex, direct query cannot be done. It will not be supported, and Power BI tells us so. For instance, if I just go over to first name and I decide to use a transform called capitalize each word, this is something that's not available within the SQL Server kind of commandlets, like what it has available to use. And you'll see immediately there's a message. This step, so if I want to keep this, if I require this step to happen, we're going to have to switch this over to import mode. Power BI is letting us know either you get rid of that step or you switch this to import. So we have to make that decision. So query folding is basically how direct query is working. It's the ability of taking this, in our case, the connection, the navigation. In my case, I'm basically modifying the select statement by doing a removed other columns. That can all be translated. So direct query is there. It also should be noted, we're not going to go into all the nuances of it, but there are limitations when it comes to using DAX, the data analysis expression language, just by going into any of these columns. If you go right back here into this model view, you can absolutely go and start a new measure. But when you start exploring what's available to us, we're going to see that some of the formulas that we are expecting, they don't exist here. So there are some limitations on which DAX calculations we can leverage. Quite a few of that falls into the realm of time intelligence, but just know that we don't have 100% access to all of the DAX capabilities when using direct query. So that's something that should just be aware of and know. We get the benefits of working with massive amounts of data. We don't need to schedule a refresh, but it comes at a couple of costs. But a lot of times, if we know what those costs are, we can do a little bit of work, maybe a little bit of effort ahead of time. And even some of those formulas, DAX is very creative. You can come about usually coming out with your results using just some additional functions that are still available to us here. So direct query, maybe you've never seen it. Just know that it is an option there for you. It's for pretty much all the relational database management systems available. Technically extends beyond this. Recently in the private previews feature, if we adventure over here into the file menu and go to options and settings, options, over here in the preview area, we actually see something that's pretty interesting. Direct query for Power BI datasets, and it says Azure AS. So this is actually Azure Analysis Services. So whereas these traditionally fell under that limited kind of live connection option I discussed very briefly, these have now made their way over into the realm of direct query. And the biggest reason why this is awesome, and hopefully I haven't come off as saying direct query is like bad. No. There's times and places for imports. There's times and places for direct query. And now that Power BI datasets, which are becoming more and more popular, tabular analysis services is supported for direct query, the biggest benefit here is what's called composite models. Now, we're not going to dive into the grand details of that. That'll be reserved for another day, another conversation. But let's look at it briefly, almost like a little teaser. Composite models. It's the best of both worlds, right? We're talking about having imported tables and we're talking about having direct query tables. So in the last example where I talked about maybe changing customer in the product table, moving those and changing them to imports, there is something called dual. That's going to be for later. We have a combination of imports and direct query tables. This is what makes up a composite model. Now, I just work solely in SQL, but imagine having a couple of SQL tables in there. That's going to be DirectQuery. And then you have a couple of things coming in from Excel, which we've described. Those have to be import. That is a composite model. And you can get the benefits of what I described, the pros from import and the pros for DirectQuery. Very powerful. And that's that new feature I just showed in the preview that's now added to Power BI datasets and Azure Analysis Services. It's already here, and it's been available for a couple of years now for the standard DirectQuery connections, but it's making its way, and we're getting new stuff in that realm, and it is super exciting because that is just an extremely powerful feature. So hopefully this quick little foray, this quick little video into what DirectQuery was about is beneficial and just shedding some light as to, what sources support DirectQuery, generally just what does it do, what's its purpose. But there's absolutely much deeper conversations that can be had, but we're going to leave that for the video which talks about composite models. And then eventually we'll talk about aggregate tables. So I hope you enjoyed this one, a quick fast one on DirectQuery, and I'll see you in the next one.